Do you get sniffly or red after eating? Do you get hives after eating certain foods? Histamine and mast cell intolerance have gotten a lot of notoriety over the last few years. They're the theme of summits and podcasts and blogs and YouTube videos, even. And it's people are getting a little scared. I kind of call it the food phobia revolution. People are scared of certain foods because of what they've heard about those foods' tendencies to cause specific reactions. So, are high histamine foods inherently bad? Is histamine intolerance a result of genetic factors? Are you or your clients doomed to suffer as a result of genetic predisposition to histamine intolerance? On today's video, we're going to explore all of that and more. Find out whether genes may be involved and what you can do to get relief. I'm Dr. Rita Marie Loscalzo, and I'm on a mission to transform our broken disease management system and empower millions of people to go from disease or dysfunction into living their healthiest life possible. So if you or your clients are wondering about the impacts of genes on histamine reactions, this episode is for you. I am super passionate about supporting you as a health seeker or you as a health practitioner to get the best possible results and learn how to use food as medicine, know which foods to avoid, which foods to put together. So let's get started. Let's start by discussing what actually histamine is, because a lot of people don't really know what it is. If you're a medical practitioner, if you're a health coach, you should. But I'll just give you an overall definition. And I have a bunch of notes that I made, and I want to make sure I cover everything. So I may be looking down at my notes here and there. So histamine is a chemical that's produced. It's an amine. It's kind of amino acid derived. Histidine is the precursor amino acid to histamine. And its function is to protect us, to push out foreign invaders by producing these inflammatory responses, these histamine, which happens to turn things red and stuffy, and eyes get watery, and people get skin rashes. Some people get belly rashes or redness on their belly when they're exposed to histamine. But the most common thing we think about in terms of histamine is allergy and cold symptoms, right? So it gets to be allergy season. The spring is notorious for that. Here in Texas, where I live, the winter is notorious for that. We get what's called cedar fever, and that's a histamine reaction. That's a response of your body to say, get rid of this, whatever this foreign invader is. The truth is, though, that foreign invader could be a bug, it could be an allergen, it could be an irritant, it could be a toxin, or it could be a component of food. So let's get into what histamine intolerance actually is. So we have this thing called histamine intolerance, and a lot of people feel like they have it because of some of the symptoms. And I'm going to share with you in a moment some of the symptoms, which seem to be pretty widespread. So histamine intolerance is caused by too much histamine in the system that overwhelms your body's capacity to break it down. And as we look closer at this, we'll see that it's either your body's producing not enough of the enzymes that break it down, or it's just producing or exposed to too many histamines. The imbalance of histamine in your body can be when you have specific genetics that predispose you to either make too much histamine or make not enough of the enzymes that break it down, or affect the cell receptors. So we're going to talk about all those things today. There's a variety of genetic variants I'll be talking about. And if you understand which of those variants you or your patient or client have, then you can really take steps to protect yourself from the effects. And it doesn't mean just giving up foods that are considered high histamine for life. It doesn't mean never mowing your lawn or going outside again during the spring season. There's ways to build up your body's tolerance to it. So what are the functions? Well, it causes allergic reactions. It acts as a defense for our immune system, causes vasodilation of blood vessels, which is why we sometimes see the cheeks getting very red, or the arms getting red, or the belly getting red. It causes bloating, diarrhea, and constipation. So combination, kind of like irritable bowel symptoms in the intestines. And in the heart, it can cause arrhythmias or dizziness. If it affects the sinuses, you're going to get drainage and congestion. If it affects the eyes, you're going to get those watery eyes, a lot of redness around the eyes. On skin, it can cause itching and hives and flushing. And it can even cause early awakening or insomnia. So it affects the sleep. When we talk about the different receptors, the types of histamine receptors, you're going to see why there's such a wide variety of symptoms. So a lot of people who have histamine intolerance are going to have many of the symptoms above, but they won't have all of the symptoms. Just because they don't have all of the symptoms doesn't mean that it's not a histamine intolerance reaction. So let's talk about two different main causes of histamine intolerance. One is not enough of the enzymes that are needed to break histamine down, and these are DAO and HMNT. Or there's too much histamine produced. It can be produced by the gut microbes. It can be produced by leaky gut. So there's extra histamine in the intestine and it's leaking into the system, the systemic circulation. So people who eat a lot of histamine foods and have a genetic predisposition, they're going to have a leak. If they have a leaky gut, they're going to get those histamines leaking into the bloodstream and causing more of a systemic reaction, like we said, around the eyes, the skin, the heart, etc. DAO, diamine oxidase, is an enzyme that comes from foods or bacteria in the gut, and it breaks it down. Or let me just say this, histamines that are produced by the bugs in your gut or are in food are broken down by this DAO enzyme. And you may have seen this DAO enzyme for sale. There are a lot of companies that sell it. I think there's one main distributor because most of the DAO supplements look the same and they bother me because they have talc in them and they have other undesirable ingredients. But we'll get to that in a moment. The DAO enzyme is controlled by a gene called AOC1. A lot of people think it's the DAO gene, and the DAO gene actually has a different function. It's related to dopamine. But the AOC1 gene is a gene that 23andMe tests, and you can look it up and you can find out if you or your client has that particular gene. And it's especially a good idea to do that to see if there's a genetic underpinning. And if it has to do with the DAO enzyme, then there's things you can do to support them in getting more or making more of that DAO enzyme. There's another one, histamine methyltransferase, HMNT, and it works throughout the body, including the brain, to deactivate and break down histamine that's created by the cells. So HMNT is responsible for eliminating a lot of the histamine that circulates throughout the body. Again, you look at that, there's a gene, HMNT, and you can look that up and see if you have it, or if you're working with clients, patients, you can look to see if they have it, which means they're going to be more prone to having this problem, and more attention needs to be paid to what they're eating, how they're eating it, the timing of what they're eating, but also to what they're taking in terms of nutrients to help support it. And I'll talk to you about nutrients in a moment. So when we look at these are fine. These are specific to histamine, but there's also other genetic SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And we're going to be going through this into way more detail if you want to know more at our upcoming event called Functional Nutrigenomics in Clinical Practice. And one of our speakers, Dr. Ben Lynch, who's an expert in nutrigenomics and has written a book called Dirty Genes, and he started a company called Seeking Health, and he also has a test that you can get a report on the genes from called Strategene. So very well versed, and his latest passion is histamine. So he's going to talk about the genetics and the lifestyle and the supplementation and all the different things you can do. So that's going to be on Friday, June 2nd at our 3-day event. We'll have the link for you in the comments. So Let's talk about other things. So one other gene that gets a lot of notoriety is MTHFR. Some people who know nothing about genes, many medical doctors who aren't really trained in this, know about MTHFR. What they don't know about MTHFR is why it has all these wide range effects and how it influences other genes. But the MTHFR SNP, which over 40% of the population has to do with the breakdown of histamines because it's related to folate. It's related to folate metabolism. And if you're eating a diet that's low in folate, which means not as many green leafy vegetables in the raw state as you should be getting, plus low in choline, which is it happens to be found in a lot of different foods, you're going to have a problem with this MTHFR contributing. So I did some research as I was preparing to talk to you today, and I looked up my genes. And there's a company called Genetic Life Hacks where you can upload your genetics, your genes from 23andMe or Ancestry.com. You can upload them there, and it has all these blog posts and all these really nice reports about different gene SNPs, and it will tell you what yours are. As you're reading, you're going, okay. So me in particular, I have a heterozygous on both MTHFR SNPs. I have some homozygous on another one that's important, which is MTRR related to B12. And I have a few of the SNPs and some of the research IDs of the DMAO, the GO, what is it, AOC1 and the HMNT. So I have to be super careful. And I know that before I made a lot of diet changes and lifestyle changes myself, one of the symptoms I had all the time was stuffiness in my nose. And the other thing I had was burning in my gut. And that all can be related to histamine. And I'll share with you in a minute about how those different receptors on different cells can manifest when we have problems with histamine. So really, really important to be aware of this stuff. So let's look at histamine production. There's a gene HDC that is an enzyme that catalyzes the reaction that takes histidine, the amino acid, into histamine, this bioactive chemical. It does this inside all kinds of cell types, including creating a lot of histamine in cells called mast cells. So if you've heard of histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome, they're related, right? Because mast cells are these cells that store histamine. They make a lot of histamine and then they burst when there's a reason, when there's an aggravating factor. So why does histamine cause headaches and stomach problems and heart problems? So let's look at the receptors. There's 4 different categories of receptors. The H1 receptors are found in smooth muscle, so that lines the blood vessels. It's also found in the central nervous system and, of course, in the mast cells. When those H1 receptors are activated, it causes allergy type swelling, such as itching, swelling, vasodilation, and all that, and asthma reactions. The H2 receptors are in the stomach. They actually, when stimulating the H2 receptors for histamine, can cause the release of stomach acid. So people who actually have too much stomach acid may have a problem with histamine promoting that. So they're also found in the intestinal tract and the walls of the blood vessels. And mast cells have these H2 receptors as well. So they have H1s and they have H2. And when they're activated, when the mast cells get activated, more histamine is released. In the heart, the H2 receptors are essential for controlling the rhythm, the contractility, the nice smooth rhythm that the heart is supposed to have. So arrhythmias can be resultant when there's too much. The H3 receptors are in the central and peripheral nervous system, and they act as a feedback loop for histamine levels in the brain. And when we have H2 receptor activation by too much histamine, we can affect serotonin, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine release. So this may cause some problems in some anxiety and some other symptoms, especially from the norepinephrine and the epinephrine. And finally, we have these H4 receptors, and they're the core of the inflammation response. So inflammation at far-reaching places. They're found in bone marrow, basophils, thymus, small intestine, spleen, colon, and the mast cells. And these are important to know about because when we have a response to histamine, it's not just going to be a runny nose, runny eyes, skin reaction. It can be anywhere in the body, which is why so many of these symptoms are hard to assess with people. People have been having certain problems like low blood pressure. They have a problem where the receptors are not allowing the blood pressure to come up. There's all sorts of reactions that you can have. And of course, some of these they're genetically mediated because you have a predisposition to it. Getting back to my own story, I didn't know about histamine receptors back then. I just knew that I had these problems, and I went to ear, nose, and throat specialists who put me on steroids and antibiotics and stuck things up my nose and gave me injections in my nose, and it was really ugly. But when I changed my diet and when I improved my gut function, those symptoms went away. Now, they can still come back if I've got a heavy exposure, but I had them all the time. So there's lots of ways that you can get out of this, and let's talk about some of those ways. There was a study that showed that people with IBS and food allergies had a lot more of these H1 and H2 receptors in their intestines. And that was probably the contributing factor for their gut being irritable. Because remember, when we talked about some of the symptoms, it could be diarrhea or constipation. Let's see, So let's get back to, are you at risk, right? Are you at risk? So let me look at some of the things that I have on my pages. Oh, alcohol. Alcohol is not a good thing for people who have histamine intolerance. We have to stop the alcohol because it causes the mast cells to release. Let's see. I went through that. There were a couple more things I wanted to make sure that I hit. So what do you do, right? What do you do if you feel like you are at risk? Well, there's lots of things that you can do if you feel like you're at risk. Let's talk about some of the symptoms. Let me see. This was something. Oh yeah. So there's a lot of histamine, low histamine food lists, high histamine food lists, and they're different from depending on what site you look at. We've tried to put that together, and at our upcoming event, we're going to be giving out these really cool charts that list not just histamine intolerance, but some of the other food intolerances, and it tells you what foods they are in, and it also tells you what symptoms they might cause. So those are going to be really good diagnostics tools that are just given away as part of the event. So what are some supplements if you have this histamine intolerance? Yes, you want to avoid high histamine foods, of course. So you get a list and you figure out which foods are high in histamine. Let's see, make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, so there are also supplements that you can take. So the initial piece is you look at the foods that are high in histamine and you reduce those. And you see if that reduces the symptoms, right? And if it does, great. If it doesn't, then we'll have to look at some supplements and some other ways of preparing food. In the meantime, while you're reducing exposure to these high histamine foods, it's really a good idea to be cleaning up the gut, right? Healing the gut lining, making it less permeable so these molecules don't get in the bloodstream. So one of the ones that's found to be helpful is vitamin B6. Pyridoxal 5-phosphate form of vitamin B6 is really important for helping to degrade histamine. So you may find that if you're sitting down to a meal, especially if you know you're sensitive and you're out to eat at a restaurant and you're not actually controlling what foods you're eating, very good idea to take some B6 before you sit down to help degrade that. Quercetin. Quercetin is another antihistamine type of an herb. It's a bioflavonoid, and you can take some quercetin. I usually recommend about 500 milligrams before each meal, and then a total over the course of a day of somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 and more if you find that you need it. There's another bioflavonoid that is not well known. It's called fisetin, and it's been shown to inhibit the mast cells from releasing their histamine. Luteolin has been shown to inhibit histamine release from the mast cells as well. So these are all bioflavonoids: quercetin, fisetin, and luteolin. And then there are DAO supplements. There's supplements that you can get that have the DAO, diamine oxidase enzyme in it to help break that down. People sometimes take it before the meal in anticipation, or sometimes because it is rather expensive, they'll wait until they start to feel like they have a reaction, or if they know they've been exposed, they take it. Either way, it can be very helpful. But like I said, look and read the labels, because a lot of them have ingredients that I don't recommend. I know that Seeking Help has a good one, and it's relatively new. The other thing, this was cool. I just learned this today as I was putting together some research. Pea shoots. You can buy pea shoots in the health food store, like in the sprouts section, that little beginning part of the pea shoots actually have DAO in them. Go figure. So that's a nice way. And you can grow them at home. You can just get sprouting seeds and start to grow them. So I would recommend you look into that if you happen to be sensitive. There's a connection between gluten sensitivity and histamine sensitivity. So people who are histamine sensitive need to avoid gluten. People who are gluten sensitive need to reduce their exposure to high histamine stuff. You also need to look at your food preparation. Leftovers in the refrigerator tend to create a higher histamine level than leftovers that are put in the freezer. So if you have a meal and you don't eat it all, rather than putting it in the refrigerator to eat the next day or the day after, put it in the freezer, and that's going to make a difference. Especially makes a difference if you're eating any animal products. If the meats tend to be very susceptible to creating histamine. Let's see. Also the way you cook. Frying and grilling tend to increase histamine levels, whereas boiling and steaming tend to decrease histamine levels. And that goes for whether you're eating vegetables or meats. You can steam your meats instead of grilling them and frying them. So you want to keep a food diary, keep track of the foods you're eating, compare it against a list. If you're working with clients and patients, you help them to do this. You teach them how to keep track of it. You show them on your charts, which you can get when you come to our event, our Nutritional Endocrinology Symposium that's happening this weekend on neslive.com, www.neslive.com. I'll put the link in the comments. It's an amazing 3 days together, and you're going to get phenomenal handouts and resources to help you support your clients or your family members if you're not a practitioner, but you just really like to geek out on all this information. So you want to identify and avoid the high histamine foods. You can put your food into an app like Chronometer and be able to see, are you getting enough of these nutrients that you need for histamine control? Certain things are going to be worse. Aged foods, fermented foods, as much as I love fermented foods, people with histamine intolerance need to go easy with it. But there are ways to prep them that will reduce the histamine response. And if you go to reinventhealthcare.com, that's my podcast, there was an episode that we did sometime in 2022 with Steph Jackson, and we talked a lot about that and how you can reduce the oxalates and histamines in some of these foods. So follow a low histamine diet. In addition, it's your lifestyle factors that are important. Stress reduction. Most people who have histamine responses also have high stress levels. Their adrenals are activated, and we need to take care of that. And then you want to support gut health, because we said there's so much going on in the gut in terms of the DAO production and in terms of the receptors. So the gut is really important to clean up and manage stress. So we want you to have the tools you need to get your health back and restore health. Genes play a role. As the saying goes, genes pull, what's they say, load the gun. The lifestyle pulls the trigger. So you may have a lot of these, and I have a lot of these genes that predispose me to histamine intolerance. And when I was younger, and when I was eating a bad diet, and I was stressed to the max in college and then in my first job, I had the manifestation. But once I cleaned up my diet, got my stress levels under control, and took charge of my health, I don't have those kinds of reactions anymore. So I encourage you to work with yourself, work with your clients to get this under control. It's not the bad food, it's not your bad genes, it's the lifestyle factors that will enable some of those genetic factors to be expressed. So keep going. Join our event, nesliveconference.com. I'll put it in the chat, and learn and learn and learn. Take charge of your health. Take charge of your patient's health. Know that what you might have learned in medical school is not enough to help people get and stay well. Yeah, it might be great for trauma. It may be great to keep them alive in the face of danger, but these are the techniques you need. So until next time, stay healthy, happy, and be unstoppable. This is Dr. Rita Marie. Watch some of the other videos for even more in-depth information.